million cashiers that are employed in the US today. If you go into an Amazon Go store, you won't see a single one. There's another 3.5 million truck, taxi, and bus drivers. When autonomous vehicles arrive, all of them are likely to be exposed to those technological developments. And there's another 2.2 million people in the US still working in call centers, just to name a few examples. And when we published this study a few years ago now, we actually also published a list, very detailed list of 702 occupations and their relative exposure to automation. And you can imagine that a lot of people picked up on some of those and said, well, this is silly, it doesn't make sense, does it, right? And my friend Ken Cookier at The Economist used to tease us because we found that fashion models are highly exposed to automation. These fashion models here actually don't exist. They've been generated through generative adversarial networks using thousands of pictures, and they're already being used by companies like Dior. And I think if we only look at the potential scope of automation, we actually also miss a lot of stuff because we're only looking at the first order effects. But there are a lot of second and third order effects as well that are reshaping the economy. So in the early days of electrification, for example, all we did was replacing the steam engine with an electric motor as the central power source of the factory. And that didn't have much of an impact on productivity growth, right? Because everything else remained intact. All of these shafts and counter shafts in the factory were still there. But it took a while for engineers to figure out that, well, actually what you can do, you can place an electric motor on every single machine. And you can then sequence them in the natural flow of production. And that is the approach that gave rise to mass production. It is what allowed Henry Ford to produce the T model at a sufficiently low price for it to become the people's vehicle. And the same approach to doing things spread gradually across industries, and that was when the main effects on the economy and productivity growth was felt. If you look at some of the early horse carriages, or the early automobiles, I should say, they actually almost look like a horse carriage, right? So all you've done is essentially replacing the horse with an internal combustion engine as the prime mover of your vehicle. And it took a while for us to figure out that, well, first of all, we can redesign the entire car. It doesn't have to look like a horse carriage. And we then realized that we need to build a lot of gasoline stations, and we need to build a lot of shops along the roads, which gave rise to road commerce and more tourists that created millions of jobs. It took a while for us to figure out that we need to build interstate highways, which gave rise to the trucking industry and changed distribution models. And it took a while for people to figure out that they actually don't have to live in congested cities any longer. They can live in the suburbs and commute into work. So the automobile from its early days just replaced the horse, but over a longer period of time, it reshaped the structure of the entire economy. And I think we can expect the same from artificial intelligence and autonomous vehicles. I'm an economist, I'm not a futurist, I will do this very briefly, but there are certain things that I think we can actually infer when autonomous vehicles emerge. So first of all, you're very unlikely to need a lot of parking space in cities or on the sidewalks. So you can make roads slimmer and you can build where parking spaces exist because the cars are actually just going to circulate out of the cities. And you can imagine that if everybody has their own automated chauffeur, they're also more likely to live further away from work and do some of the work in the cars on the way home. So density is maybe not going to be that much of an issue in city centers any longer as a result of that. And lastly, the car itself is clearly going to look very different, right? It may not look as this 1950s version with the family playing board games, you may have a Netflix subscription instead, or the car may have a minibar and that will be the most expensive part of your trip. But what is clear is that it has the potential to change a lot in terms of how we live and work, provided that we let it do that. Because I think that the economist Leontief was onto something when he suggested that what happened on the farms, if horses could have joined the Democratic Party and voted, what happened on the farms might have turned out differently. They could have used their political clout, their political voice, to bring the spread of the tractor to a halt. And we're already seeing some examples of that. So this is truck drivers who went on strike in the state of Missouri the other week, demanding legislation to block the introduction of autonomous trucks as they are getting more pervasive. This is dock workers who went on strike in Los Angeles Harbor a couple of months ago, fearing autonomous cargo trucks. Now, they did misunderstand our paper slightly. It's not a conspiracy. We're not planning to automate. It's 47% of the jobs. But what this shows is that the societal response to automation is to some extent already taking place. When I began to write the book a couple of years ago, robot taxis wasn't on anybody's radar. Now it's being discussed on both sides of the Atlantic. Bill de Blasio proposed a robot tax the other week, and worker councils would essentially decide whether businesses should be allowed to automate or not, and whether it's essential for the company. So I think we're seeing, to some extent, some of the backlash against automation already happening. Now, the point is not that there won't be jobs in the future. I'm absolutely certain that there will be. And if you go back to 1900, right, and you ask somebody, or your grandmother or your great-grandfather, what do you think will be the jobs of the early 20th century? They wouldn't have said, well, my daughter is most certainly going to be a software engineer and my son is going to be a hot yoga teacher. That would have been very unlikely. And I think in a similar fashion, we're very much sort of struggling to predict the jobs that will emerge in the future. But we can at least now cast some of the things that are happening in the labor market right now. And LinkedIn did a little survey on their platform a while ago, looking at new and emerging jobs. And among those, you can find iOS developers and data scientists and social media interns and Zumba instructors. And you can also find big data architects, digital marketing specialists, and the Beachbody coach. And what is the point with this? Well, I think this actually reflects a broader pattern that we've seen in the labor market over the past couple of decades, where you see that new jobs are emerging in very skilled industries that are highly clustered. And those people earning higher wages are demanding a lot of in-person type of services that are hard to automate. And you can see this even in official statistics now. So sommelier, for example, is a job that's existed for a long time. It's only very recently became its own job title because we tend to demand more of them as we grow wealthier. This is some joint work done with Thor Berger a couple of years ago. And what it shows is that there's been a shift in where these new jobs are actually emerging. So before the computer revolution of the 1980s, new jobs were actually recently dispersed across space. Since then, and you can also see in the statistics that more of these job titles directly relate to computer technologies, they have become increasingly clustered in skilled cities. And what happens when you create one new tech job in a city like London or Oxford is that person goes out in the local economy, goes to the hairdresser, goes grocery shopping, uses the transportation system and so on and so forth. And that creates on average 5 new jobs in the local non-traded service economy. And as a consequence of that, economic activity has become much more clustered. Some of you may remember this sort of debate in the end of the 1990s where people predicted the end of the office, and Tom Friedman famously wrote his book, The World is Flat. But since that, the opposite has actually happened. Economic activity has become increasingly clustered in these skilled cities. And the flip side of that is that where robot technologies or automation technologies have been adopted, the exact opposite has happened. So in old manufacturing cities where jobs have been automated away, the local service economy has taken a hit as well. And as a result of that, we're seeing many of these social problems that I mentioned earlier. Now, so in conclusion, what I think is the key message of this book is that in a way, we have been here before, and in a way, resistance to technological change has been the historical norm rather than the exception. And I think, as the great economist Joseph Schumpeter observed, that technological progress also involves creative destruction in employment, meaning that there will be both winners and losers. And if a lot of people see their jobs and incomes under threat, they are likely to opt against it. And one reason that economic growth was actually slow for so long is that workers vehemently resisted any technology that threatened their jobs and incomes, and fearing social unrest, monarchs and governments typically sided with their workers. And I think what we need to do is that we need to make sure that people benefit from these technologies also in the short run, to ensure continued acceptance for them. Because in the end of the day, technological progress isn't a natural force, it requires societal acceptance. And the great difference to the Industrial Revolution this time around is that we're in a much better position to actually manage and shape the outcome. The book concludes with a few policy proposals, which I won't go into here. So if you want to read about those, you actually have to buy the book. It's a great gift for family and friends, and maybe we can open for discussion here. So thanks very much.
Thanks, Carl, very much for that very, very fascinating short summary of what is an immensely readable and important book. We have about 15 minutes. This is being webcast and videoed, so be aware that if you're asking a question that you might be broadcast live around the world. And with that, I hope not intimidating comment, who'd like to pose a question to Carl?
Yeah, thank you. My name's Jan.
Can you wait for the microphone, please? Can you pass that down?
Thank you. My name is Jan, founder partner of an investment firm investing in education businesses, in part to address some of these challenges you've pointed out. Carl, if you could wave a magic wand to ensure that as many people as possible benefit from these new technologies, as opposed to being pushed down into underemployment or low-skilled jobs, what would you like to do?
Well, if I answer your question, I'm basically giving away the selling proposition of the book, but I'll give it a go. So I think, unfortunately, there's a tendency to say that we have this really big challenge and we need one big solution to solve it, and that's universal basic income. I think there's a lot of things that